fortunate to have a very distinguished lady today to speak about her grandfather, who was a Major General and a doctor in the First World War. He went to Gallipoli, then he went to France and helped to devise the casualty clearing stations. But he also was responsible for an autopsy on a well-known German ace. And I'm very proud to introduce to you, to speak to you today, this is Jenny Mills.
On April the 21st, 1918, in the Somme Valley, I said to some friends the other night that I was talking about the Red Baron, and this friend, Susan, said, all I know about the Red Baron is Snoopy and the Red Baron, and I don't know if many of you knew about Snoopy, the dog, the comic dog. Anyway, I feel flattered that I've been asked to give this paper. In May 2006, Tony Munday organised a trip to northern France, and Brian John, with contacts in the area, arranged for us to visit the Villers-Bretonneux High School. Brian encouraged me to talk to the students about my grandfather's involvement in the post-mortem on the Red Baron on April the 22nd, 1918, 90 years ago. For these children, the shooting down of the Red Baron was a legend. It heralded the recapture by the Australians of Villers-Bretonneux on April the 25th, 1918, Anzac Day actually, a turning point in the Great War of 1914-1918. Some of the children's great-grandparents would have watched the Baron's final dogfight from nearby fields. For the children, the details of the somewhat ad hoc post-mortem which my grandfather carried out were a good blood and guts story. On April the 8th, 1918, my grandfather, Colonel George Barber, became responsible for the management of the Australian Army Medical Services in France. This included the Australian Flying Corps. It was a big job for the former Kalgoorlie pioneer doctor. At the time of the Red Baron's death, he was on a visit to the Australian Flying Corps, No. 3 Squadron, at Poulenville, near Vaux-sur-Somme. He was told that the Red Baron had been shot down in the area the morning before. The body was in a tent hangar and had just been officially examined by 2 high-ranking British medical officers. Naturally, my grandfather was curious to see what had happened to this famous aviator. The highly decorated Baron Manfred von Richthofen, was 26 years old and credited with 80 victories in the air. They say that every time he shot down a plane, he had a silver cup made. His red Fokker triplane, leading his famous flying circus unit, was renowned for its success. Barber put off other appointments, as anybody would, to view the body. He was probably aware of the tensions already growing between Australian artillery forces of the 4th and 5th Divisions and men of the British and Australian Flying Corps as to who shot von Richthofen down. There were 2 flying and 3 field battery claims for the honours. Barber was not to know then that his inspection of the Baron's body and a subsequent letter to the Australian official army historian Charles Bean, many years later, would eventually help prove that the Baron was shot from the ground by Australians. It was a difficult time for the British forces. The German Operation Michael in the area around Amiens forced the Allies into retreat with terrible losses in late March 1918. Many soldiers had been badly gassed. Army medical planning was in disarray, and this, I think, is horrifying. Hospital and aid posts were captured, and dressings, bandages, and medical equipment were lost or in short supply. You can imagine the chaos. By the beginning of April, the British managed to halt the German advance. Barber, in his new job, was visiting the Australian divisions in the area to make medical preparations for another expected battle, the big one round Villers-Bretonneux and later on Amiens. He was known as an outstanding administrator. It was obvious that the Germans would attempt to capture the important British-held railway centre at Amiens. For this coming battle, von Richthofen's flying circus was ordered to the area, as was the British 209 Squadron, commanded by flying hero Major Butler. The Australian Flying Corps No. 3 Squadron was already at Poulenville. The battle stressed the Allied forces' morale was at an all-time low. Something was needed to restore confidence. Von Richthofen's death came at the right time. 3 days later, as I said before, on April the 25th. So there we have the Red Baron dressed for flight. Those flying boots, I think, are at Point Cook, or one might be on the Australian War Memorial. We'll talk about that a bit later. Richthofen's death was probably his own fault. It was said that he was still suffering headaches from a head wound inflicted in October 1917. And like other air aces of both sides, there could have been cumulative battle stress. This happened to a British air ace, another German air ace. They just were getting to a stage where they were losing it. And it could have affected, this battle stress could have affected his concentration. The excitement of the chase appeared to affect his judgment. Flying low over enemy territory, he appeared unaware of the dangers. The prevailing wind was an easterly rather than usual westerly. This could have caused him to fly faster. I don't know if I read that somewhere. But there's the model of his Fokker. The main weapon on the ground for both the German and British forces was the artillery. The Australian 4th Division, 24th Machine Gun Company, and the Australian 5th Division, 53rd Field Battery, were part of the British 4th Army, stationed along Morlancourt Ridge. And there are the 2 crash sites. Vaux-sur-Somme is at the bottom of the star, and then there's the next one which shows Morlancourt Ridge, which is way over there. So they were stationed along Morlancourt Ridge between the Somme and the Anchor Rivers. The 5th Division was commanded by another West Australian, General Talbot Hobbs. He'd been a prominent Perth architect in Perth, and like Barber originally, his interest was in the volunteer defence before the First World War. Hobbs' statue is on the Perth foreshore. Hobbs was recognised as a good, thoughtful general who cared for his men. At this time, he was worried about morale and knew that his troops from officers downward needed encouragement. On April the 21st, an estimated 1,000 people on the ground watched the Red Baron's final dogfight as he chased Canadian pilot Lieutenant Wilf May across the sky. High above and unseen, May's boss and former schoolmate, Canadian Air Ace Captain Roy Brown, followed. Both Canadian pilots were from 209 Squadron and flying Sopwith Camel aircraft. The noise of the firing was enormous. The Baron fired intermittently, and it was thought that he was having trouble with his machine guns as he slid backwards and forwards in the cockpit. Allied soldiers, evidently he was moving, and they felt he was having trouble. Allied soldiers stood up against orders, absolutely fascinated, silhouetted along the high ridge to get a better view, while hidden gun crews waited for an opportunity to fire the fatal shot. There's now some more, Brian. There's a watercolour coming up. Yes, let's go back there. That's the 5th Division headquarters. And then there's another one of Major General Hobbs in his office. And then there's one of the Red Baron's triplane. May's plane, followed by the Red Baron, flew so low that it nearly knocked the tiles from a high stone gate post, so they must be terribly low. Officers ran out of billets to get a better view. Captain Brown fired from above at von Richthofen, and believing that he had hit the red triplane several times, he peeled off and went back to base to report his win. He was an air ace. It was only later that he found out that the pilot of the German plane that he'd been chasing was von Richthofen. And the Red Baron in the dogfight, the Red Baron was in trouble, and the fatal dive. Von Richthofen continued to follow May for at least 1 kilometre, passing over the ridge under close fire from rifles and machine guns. He then, for some reason, abandoned the chase, banked eastward, and rose several hundred metres before he swerved northwards and slowly glided to the ground in a controlled forced landing. The red triplane rose again about 3 metres from the ground, stalled, and then crashed. Everyone ran to the stricken plane. The Red Baron was dying inside. And that's something that's not often reported. Some say he was killed, some say the plane was smashed. But in actual fact, the plane was intact and he was dying inside. And he muttered to the first soldier, "Reach him, Alice kaput. It's all over for me." Souvenir hunters, this is why people think it crashed. The souvenir hunters were there in a flash. They stripped the plane and stole the Baron's binoculars, his belts, boots, his articles of clothing, including his boots, as well as parts of his triplane. In fact, I've been told that General Hobbs had a bit of that triplane in his study in Pembroke Grove. Under the Baron's flying clothes, he wore red silk pyjamas. I think that was bravado. His jaw was broken and his body covered in blood. The Australian official War I historian, Charles Bean, writes, "Certainly no one who watched from the ground the last minute of the exciting chase with only 2 planes in the picture will ever believe that von Richthofen was killed by a shot from a 3rd aeroplane, which no one from Vaux onwards observed." And a British military officer, P. Hutton, wrote in 1935, "As anti-aircraft officer on the spot, I claim to be in the position to judge. Later in the day, the Air Force came to me for confirmation of their claim, which was then the rule, but I couldn't substantiate it." Rumours spread about rewards for shooting down the famous aviator, so that every soldier was anxious to make a claim. Army and Air Force commanding officers were keen for their units to get the credit. Who shot down the Red Baron? Was it Captain Roy Brown, who believed he did? Or, as claimed later, the 2-man crew from the Australian No. 3 Squadron on photo reconnaissance, who fired on von Richthofen before he peeled off chasing May? Was it one of the 53rd Field Battery Australian Lewis gunners? And they were called Robert Buey and Snowy Evans. And they were actually camp cooks who were on gun duty for the day. Again, could it have been crack shot machine gunner Sergeant Cedric Popkin of the 4th Division 24th Machine Gun Company? Popkin, who was known as an H-shot, took control from his Vickers gun crew, pushed them out of the way, and said in order to have 2 goes at the Red Baron, one when he was in one place and one which could have been the fatal shot. So we have now Captain Roy Brown, and the positions of the Red Baron, Captain Brown, and Lieutenant May over Vaux-sur-Somme. So this became the great argument over years and years, who shot down the Red Baron. The Australian gunners were sure that the Baron was their prize, while the 2 Air Force squadrons were sure that it belonged to one of their own. The decision to award Captain Roy Brown a bar to his DSC in May 1918 for shooting down von Richthofen astounded many, and all his life Brown seemed embarrassed by this distinction. Since then, many interviews have been conducted and many papers and books written on the subject. At a time when the Allied forces were anxiously preparing for another German offensive, everyone was anxious to resolve the arguments before the Air Force, between the Air Force and the Army as quickly as possible. To this end, there were 3 so-called post-mortems and 2 separate inquiries into the incident almost straight away. It was the contradictory findings of the two first postmortems that set the scene for controversy over all the later years. Colonel Barber's decisive postmortem was the last, but not really discussed until it was investigated by war historian Charles Bean in 1935. Barber did send a report to the Anzac Corps Commander General Birdwood, but this never came to light. Birdwood was probably too busy. And now we have Henry Fuller's watercolour of the Baron's body being removed. I think that's quite a famous painting. You've probably seen it before. We also have the pilots and observers of number 3, the Australian squadron, at the wreckage. And that wreckage was really the souvenir hunters, remember. And now, then we have Sergeant Popkin, the very ace machine gunner. The first post-mortem was ordered by the commanding officer of 22 Wing HQ, Lieutenant Colonel Cairns, in order to settle the dispute between 209 Squadron and the Australian Squadron. Cairns knew his men needed a morale booster and hoped that the first investigation would quickly give credit to one of his units. The Flying Corps had suffered great losses in the last few months. The next morning, he expected the consulting surgeon, Colonel Thomas Sinclair, and the consulting physician, Colonel John Nixon, from the British 4th Army HQ, to carry out the so-called official post-mortem. So we have Cairns getting his men to do a post-mortem and wanting his people to win. And then we have the big brass coming from the 4th Army. The two medical officers from 22 HQ were Captain Norman Gray and Lieutenant Downs. They tackled their job late at night in a tent hangar. In fact, I think it was at midnight. It is interesting, but before this investigation, Senior Medical Orderly Corporal Edward McCarty found a spent bullet which fell out of the Baron's clothing. The bullet later mysteriously disappeared as the Baron's body was moved about. Well, nobody knows who had it. It was said to have a sharp indentation, as if it had struck something hard. Everyone on the camp knew that there was a bullet hole in the right-hand side of the Baron's plane. It was assumed that the fatal bullet was a 303 Mark 7 with Spitzer-shaped nose and a cylindrical body used in Lee Enfield rifles, Vickers and Lewis machine guns. The missing bullet could have resolved all arguments. Whether McCarty, but he was a senior medical orderly, so he probably wouldn't have nicked it. The first medical investigation by the two young officers of the squadron said, "We examined the body. We found that he had one entrance and one exit wound caused by the same bullet. The entrance wound was situated on the right side of the chest in the posterior fold of the armpit. The exit wound was situated at a slightly higher level near the front of the chest, the point of exit being about ½ an inch below the left nipple and about 3/4 of an inch external to it." It concluded, "The gun firing this bullet must have been situated in the same plane as the long axis of the German machine and fired from the right and slightly behind the right of von Richthofen. We are agreed that the situation of the entrance and exit wounds are such that they could not have been caused by the fire from the ground." So they gave the award. Well, they said that it had been done from the air. By now, 3 Squadron relinquished its claim, realizing that it was too early on the scene to have caused death. The medical officers assumed that if von Richthofen was shot from the ground, the bullet would have entered his chest and exited through his back. So in other words, if from the ground it would come up through and back. Despite the fact that Captain Brown was behind and above the Baron and to the left, the post-mortem concluded that Captain Roy Brown of 209 Squadron shot down the Red Baron. That night there was much elation in the mess. There was even a story reported by a 209 Squadron officer in 1957, long time after the Baron's fatal fall, that the Baron's body was brought into the mess and sat in a chair to be examined. while everybody discussed which way. What do you think? It's probably apocryphal. By the morning of April 22nd, the 4th British Army Medical Services consulting physician, arrived to carry out the official post-mortem, the big brass. These high-ranking medical officers were not too pleased that 22 Squadron had jumped the gun. In later years, consulting physician Colonel Nixon explained their finding. The plane had only been hit by one single bullet, which passed through the fuselage and entered the chest in the middle of the right axilla. Traveling horizontally, it struck the front of the vertebra and glanced off probably into the heart, but we did not open the body to make our examination. Enough had been established to dispose of all the claims we had heard. No one had claimed to have come alongside of von Richthofen and fired horizontally at him. There's a diagram now of these senior medical men gave an open verdict, and that really set the cat amongst the pigeons, because one had given it to the squadrons and the other had given an open verdict. Both the newly formed RAF and the Army wished the matter sorted out quickly. Major General Sir John Salmon, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Air Force, despite the open verdict of the official post-mortem, decided to accept Brown's claim. General Sir Henry Rawlinson, Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Army, was not so sure. He heard about machine gunner Sergeant Popkin's claim, and Sergeant Popkin's claim had been sitting on a desk and so wasn't in right at the beginning. It took a couple of days to come through. And busy before Rawlinson, busy before battle, asked General Hobbs to do something about it. Hobbs, who had already given his division a holiday on the understanding that it was his men who shot down the Baron, appointed war correspondent Charles Bean to look into the matter. Hobbs rather wanted the nosy Bean, the journalist, out of his way as he prepared for the big battle round Villers-Bretonneux, and had to deal with his General Pompierre, or his brigadier. Bean eventually gave credit to the 253 3rd Field Battery Camp Cooks, Bury and Evans. At this stage, Sir John Salmon suggested the Army and the Air Force share the honours. Hobbs passed this suggestion down the line of command to Gunner Bury, who absolutely refused in no uncertain Australian language. In 1935, this Australian official war historian, by now this was the official war historian, Charles Bean was later to change that opinion. That is where my grandfather, Colonel George Walter Barber, comes in. Bean, aware of the intense debate ever since 1918, began to look at the matter as he wrote his official war history. He thought about Sergeant Popkin's confident claim, which had been ignored by his HQ until about April 25th. Popkin was an excellent shot, and whoever shot down the Red Baron would have to correctly calculate a complicated deflection angle as the Baron's triplane ducked and wove across the sky. Popkin had 2 separate shots, as I've said before, and they were carefully aimed shots. Bean wrote to Barber, by now a retired Major General, at a country GP at Kalamunda in Western Australia. Barber replied on October the 23rd, 1935, and I'm lucky to have a copy of this letter and also the diagrams that Barber made of the actual entry and exit of the bullet that killed von Richthofen. These were sent to me by Jeremy Richter, who's the director at the Australian War Memorial Research Centre. And if anybody ever needs help, that research centre at the Australian War Memorial is a fantastic place to go. Bean would have really respected Barber's judgment, knowledge, and his judgment. Barber's diagram, however, paradoxically, as you will see, had the bullet entering left bag and exiting right nipple. He did write at the bottom of the diagram, and you have to remember he was quite old by then, Richthofen, approximate sites of entry. I forget now which was which, but I think the site of entry was the one in the back. And he was a pretty direct old man by then, so Now we have a copy of Barber's letter to Bean. And he writes, as gentlemen wrote in those days, "My dear Bean, with reference to your letter of October the 14th, and this is where the big surprise, I think, comes for you, all of you, and this is a bit that the children at Villas Bretano really liked. With reference to your letter, October the 14th, I was inspecting this army unit and found the medical orderly washing Richthofen's body, so I made an examination. There were only 2 bullet wounds, one of entry and one of exit, of a bullet which had evidently passed through the chest and the heart. There was no wound of the head, but there was considerable bruising over the right jaw, which may have been fractured. The orderly told me that the consulting surgeon of the army had made a post-mortem that morning. Asked how he did it, as there was no evidence. In fact, Barber walked in and Red Baron was covered with a sheet, you know, and they pulled the sheet down. Actually, Barber made them take his clothes off. Nobody had taken his clothes off, apart from what had been nicked by the souvenir hunters. And Barber said, you know, well, they haven't done anything. What did they do? I asked him how they did it, as there was no evidence. The orderly told me that the consulting surgeon had used a bit of fencing wire, which he had pushed along the track of the wound over the heart. So he got fencing, put it through one. And I'm not sure if it came out the other end or if it only got up to the vertebra. I should have understood that better. I used the same bit of wire for the same purpose, says Barber. So you see, the medical examination was not a thorough one, and not a post-mortem examination in the ordinary sense of the term. A bullet hole in the side of the plane coincided with the wound through the chest, and I'm sure he was shot from below while banking. I sent a full report to General Birdwood at Australian Corps, and have often wondered what became of it. With kind regards, yours sincerely, George Barber. Barber also sent Bean another letter written to the Perth Daily News by him on December 22nd, 1934, but not posted. At the top of the letter he wrote, "This is a letter I wrote but decided not to send, as I hate these paper controversies." In the actual letter he stated, "With reference to your article, how von Richthofen died, General Monash was in error when stating that von Richthofen was shot through the head. There were only 2 wounds, one of entry and one of exit, of a bullet which had evidently passed through the heart. I made an examination of the body and furnished a report to Australian Corps Commander." And there's Barber's letter to the Daily News. Oops. Barber's positive correspondent helped confirm Bean's research and certainty that the Red Baron was indeed shot from the ground, and to also change the historian's mind so that he eventually believed that it was Sergeant Popkin of the 24th Machine Gun Company, 4th Division, who fired the fatal shot. Popkin, the acknowledged machine gunner, is. This was perhaps further confirmed as late as 1944 by former Private Robert Ernest Nutman of the 27th Company Australian Army Signal Corps, when he wrote to the RSL journal Reveil. Nutman visited the French signals section at Corby near Amiens in April 1918, where he was shown a signal stating that von Richthofen had been shot down by an Australian machine gunner. And I haven't seen this in any books I've read. I was lucky enough to find this letter at the Australian War Memorial, and it was in a whole batch of correspondence belonging to General House, another medico. It says, what Nutman said was, "There is one fact of which I am very positive underlined, and that is that the signal message from English Corps to General Devaney, the French commander, certainly credited an Australian machine gunner with the kill. This is the first occasion which I have related these facts to any publication." That was 1944. And nobody else seems to have picked that one up, so I feel quite pleased about that. The Red Baron was given a full military funeral by the Allies. Later his body was transported on a special train back to Germany. Crowds lined the railway line in respect for a great airman. Brian, 2 more photos, please. There's for the funeral. And you see the Australian starched hats. And then there's one more, I think, with the... just a little final bit. After the Great War, Barber became Director General of Australian Army, Air Force and Civil Aviation Medical Services from 1925 to 34. His eldest daughter, Jean, married Mervyn Hobbs, son of General Sir Talbot Hobbs, in 1922. It is surely appropriate that, as the granddaughter of George Barber and Talbot Hobbs, my cousin Sue Darling should have the last word about who shot down Red Baron. She emailed me when I'd asked her if there was a family legend about the Red Baron, and before I was told that there was a bit of the Red Baron's plane in the general study. I thought it was always said that it was a digger cleaning his gun who had a lucky pot shot.